All right, so let's go ahead and talk about Ruth Benedict, Mary Midgley, and Philip Hallie or Haley. I'm not certain how he pronounces his name. Start out with Ruth Benedict, who's a famous anthropologist of the first part of the 20th century. Is significantly associated with the doctrine of cultural relativism, namely that moral distinctions are relative to culture. Now, I can say as a background, little background to this, there are two different interpretations of cultural relativism, perfectly compatible with one another. One is the empirical interpretation that, as a matter of fact, values differ from culture to culture. That's just a plain fact, right? That's just a plain fact. So there are Japanese values or the predominant values of Japanese culture, Russian values, uh, English values, Canadian values, and say Peruvian values, right? And these are not the same. There may be significant overlap between the cultures I just mentioned. For example, perhaps a prohibition against murder and a prohibition against theft. But those things tend to vary internally as well, believe it or not. And then there'll be differences that, significant differences that crop up for ethnographers who study these matters. So the second interpretation is that of, well, the second interpretation is the normative interpretation of cultural relativism. The normative interpretation is what's really at stake here. Normative interpretation says that the members of a culture are bound morally by the norms and values of their particular culture. And so, in a word, what is right is culturally defined. Okay? So, and there's an implication, if that's true, there's an implication that since relative to Japanese culture, a certain practice is right, and looking at that practice from outside of Japanese culture, we might be tempted to condemn it. We'd be making a mistake, right? That's the idea. For example, the idea that one has a right to chop somebody in half with one's new samurai sword. That was a feature of Japanese society, or at least of the samurai segment of society, which fought on behalf of the aristocrats, of course. And there's probably an asterisk that accompanies that permission, that right, that privilege to cut people in half. It had better darn well not be the shogun, right, or any of the important members of his court. The people getting chopped in half, trust me, were the peasants, right? Okay, trust me on that one. Okay, so the normative interpretation of cultural relativism is quite strong, isn't it? Right? It would forbid me and you from condemning the practice of allowing certain parts of a society the right to cut other parts of that society in half, other persons from that society in half, right? It would forbid us from condemning how certain members of pre-modern Indian society would treat their so-called untouchables, basically like they were walking feces. Nope, that's Indian society. You know, we can't understand them. We have no right, in fact, and it would even be wrong, right, for us to criticize them. Okay, let's go ahead and see if we can analyze this more carefully and see whether or not cultural relativism stands up. At the beginning of the course, I gave you an argument to the effect that its cousin, subjective relativism, collapses in contradiction, and cultural relativism would collapse in contradiction due to the same closely allied argument. You go back to my original slides to look at that, but let's erase that for the moment and go back to the beginning and consider this through our study of Benedict and her opponent, Midgley, and implicit opponent, Hallie, though we'll get to it. So Benedict begins with this distinction here, the normal versus the abnormal, right? And that, as a matter of fact, varies between cultures. No one's going to disagree with her on that, okay? It's just a plain fact. I gave you some examples of cultures. You can provide yourself with examples. I'm half my family's down in Peru, and absolutely, North American culture derived from mainly Northern European values, significantly those of Great Britain and Scandinavia and Germany, right, differ. This culture here differs really profoundly from what we encounter in Catholic Peru, Catholic top to bottom, right, the whole thing. And we get this watered down kind of Protestantized Catholicism here in Rhode Island. Nothing against our diocese, guys. I'm not, but yeah, you go to Peru, it's much more, it's closer to like 18th century Spain over there, right? They've been watering it down there too, but you get a jolt when you go down there relative to what we experience here. Let me take my word for it. Okay, so let's look at some examples here of what's normal versus abnormal relative to competing or different societies. What we might call catatonia, a person like falling into some kind of whoopsie daisy. What happened there? Well, I can't seem to control this thing. There we go. All right. What we might call, here it is, catatonia, a person, becoming very still or maybe rolling about a bit and moaning, perhaps having visions and even producing weird sounds. I saw a video the other day of some people who got together and thought they were channeling the Holy Spirit, and they were all standing in a room saying papaya, 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 the fruit, right, over and over again. I don't want to question anybody's spiritual practice in the class, okay? Right? I'm not here to attack your spiritual practice. But some persons would describe that as a kind, well, psychiatrists, for example, would look at that and say, okay, these persons are undergoing a certain kind of pathology or dysfunction, right? And you guys have picked up by now in this course, I'm not exactly very critical of certain ideas derived from religion, right? Okay, so I'm not attacking these people, but I'm just telling you what psychiatrists would say. They would look at that and say there's a certain dysfunction there. I'll just tell you what other religious people would say. They would say that that is a spiritual phenomenon, only it's demonic. I'm not going to tell you what it is or is not. That's not my job. Again, I have people here who practice a variety of religions. They might engage in channeling the Holy Spirit. I am not going to pass judgment on that. Okay, this is not I'm here to help you understand the philosophical arguments. I'm just giving you an example. Okay, so there is that particular example. So the psychiatrist would say that's a bad thing, right? The Roman Catholics and Pentecostals, right? They're the ones who originated this in the United States. They would look at that and say that's a good thing. Okay, and that's right within one culture. Very good. And then we turn to so-called, primitive cultures, whatever that word means in this particular context. I guess pre-technological, right? Perhaps they don't yet use, they haven't figured out how to smelt iron ore, right, or bronze or anything of that sort, rather copper, and whatnot. So in those particular societies, we regularly encounter shamans who will take hallucinogens very often, and that will put them into some kind of state that we today would call trance. And then they would believe they were communing with spirits. They're learning something from the spirits. They were spies of sorts. The spirit would tell them where somebody had dropped his bow and arrow, for example. It's a common sort of thing, or give them the position of the enemy. Then they would communicate what they learned, and that was that. Whereas the psychiatrists today in our Western society would say those persons are hallucinating, right? Okay. We today, from a scientific point of view, might say that someone is experiencing a seizure. Whereas in one of those so-called primitive societies, they would say, no, that person's in spiritual ecstasy, right? So what's normal versus what's abnormal is going to change depending upon your cultural point of view, right? Seizures for us are abnormal. I guess they're becoming more frequent, right? Given as the health of the country declines, but they're abnormal. But in another context, they're perfectly normal and even good and desirable. Okay. All right. Then there's homosexuality, and in some societies, for example, New England Native American societies, homosexuality, like no big deal, no problem. They had the Benedict. The Benedict was the individual a fellow who dressed up like a woman. Now this has become there's been a big push for this to be made mainstream and acceptable the last at least 15 years. And it's been pushed more aggressively. Well, it's the first time in my life it's been pushed aggressively to the point where they, say it's, a man who dresses in a woman's dress and undergoes surgery to make himself appear more like a woman. Perfectly viable candidate, for CEO of Bank of America or Secretary of State or something like that. It's been a real push to totally normalize that. It's the first time in my lifetime that's been done. The push to normalize homosexuality is as old as I am, at least. It's older than that. And what's interesting, this also varies across time. In ancient Greece, homosexuality was sort of halfway accepted. Okay, one has to qualify that. People always say, "Oh, it was celebrated in ancient Greece." Yeah, sort of. There was a death penalty for propositioning a boy in ancient Greece. Yet they would do it and kind of look the other way. But there was a death penalty in ancient Athens, at least. Okay, and then prior to about 1980, they spoke of the love that dare not speak its name. This is not a phrase that is used any longer, except maybe in Idaho or something. I don't know. I'm not there. Maybe in certain parts of Alabama. If you're a more rural part of the country, maybe they still speak that particular way. Maybe at certain truck stops and whatnot. Okay. All right. So, how about even agricultural practice? I mean, it goes right down to the basics. All human beings engaged in agriculture pull nourishment directly from the earth. Well, you can base your agricultural practices on natural relationships. Okay, put the seed in the soil, water it, make sure there's sunlight, and it's going to grow, and I'm going to take care of it. I'm going to weed the soil around it, get rid of the annoying, useless plants, and I'm going to kill any bugs to try to eat my plant. Or you can base your agricultural practice on black magic, as people in Micronesia do. Amazing, no? Okay, so I think it was Melanesia, pardon me, not Micronesia. They might do it in Micronesia too, for all I know. Here we witness that there's a constant concern with being poisoned. Well, that might be a practical response to the fact that people are poisoning one another, but let's put that off for a moment. There's the forbidding of sharing of seed, right? So we're looking at a society where relationships of trust have been dissolved or shattered. And in a situation like that, which has become thoroughly competitive and even embodies a sort of mutual hatred of one family for another, sharing disappears, cooperation disappears, or of course sharing disappears, right? They're not going to help one another at the level of work. They're not going to share information with one another. They're not going to share seed or anything of that sort. But her point is that that's regarded as normal. Okay, all right. In some societies, like ours, friendliness is desirable, but in others, as in the one we just considered, it's undesirable. All right. So she's establishing the empirical thesis quite easily. I mean, there are these differences. That's just a fact. Okay. And she gives us another interesting example, our own homegrown example here in the Northwest of the Kwakiutl tribe. If a loved one in American civilization dies, we mourn the person. But the Kwakiutl, they don't take that standing down. I mean, they don't do this any longer, as far as I know. They might, secretly on a reservation somewhere. But in the old days, when they actually were sovereign in that territory, particularly the chiefs, a child of the chief died, he wouldn't take that standing down. He would sort of assume that was sort of, a magical attack on the part of the neighboring and opposing tribe, and he would go on the warpath and go and kill a few of those people, and that was that. So we just mourn. They take vengeance, and that's normal there, right? Okay. So these are very interesting anthropological details and observations. What can we derive from them for moral philosophy? That's the question. All right. So here's the argument that she has put forward so far. Normality varies culturally. That's definitely true. And therefore, normality is culturally defined. Okay, that seems to be true too, but let's try to figure out what she's saying. And by the way, we haven't yet gotten to any kind of conclusion that would affect any of the moral doctrines we have studied thus far. It almost seems like we're talking about something else here. We're in the area of anthropology rather than ethics. So far that's the case. What Benedict wants to argue is that anthropology does provide material which is relevant for ethics. Well, let's see if that works. Before we move on, let's evaluate this argument. So the argument moves from a simple observation to a causal thesis. Okay. So culture is the cause of what is taken to be normal within that culture. Okay. So I'm going to raise an objection to this. This causal thesis borders on being totally vacuous. I mean, so culture is the cause of what is taken to be normal within that culture. Well, what? Yeah, sure. What are you telling me when you say that? What is a culture other than those patterns of belief and practice that, as a matter of course, are normal for those who are members of that culture, right? So to say that culture, that normality is culturally defined, well, I don't know. That's like saying something so blatantly obvious that one needn't argue for it, right? It's like saying that, well, bachelors are unmarried males who've never been married. I know that already. You know, this seems almost true by definition, but maybe she would say this in response. A culture is a pre-existing entity relative to those who are born into it. It does play a causal role in shaping the beliefs and practices of children. Well, that's certainly true. It's even interesting in a way, right? So, I mean, granted, but what does this imply for ethics with respect to the claim that there are objective norms and values, or that there are not objective norms and values? Do you follow? There are two possibilities there. Either there are no objective norms and values, right? Or there are. Okay. Now, there's an interesting distinction there. If you say that there are, you might say, well, they're objective relative to a culture. They're objective. People in that culture, they're bound by them, but they're bound by them only if they belong to that culture. It's a necessary condition, right? You guys follow me? It's a kind of a strange position. Usually people push that forward and say, well, hold on a second. If norms and values are relative to cultures, then there are no objective norms and values. And things just go on the way they do in the Philippines and on the way that they do in Kenya, and likewise in Chile, and so on and so forth. And that's that. Okay. But there is this middle ground, a relativism that we're still looking at. Okay, so let's back this up a bit. We have to now relate these two concepts, normality and normativity. All right? Normality, that has to do with an empirical observation. Normativity has to do with what one is genuinely obligated to do or not to do. Okay. And with respect to normativity, right, we've identified at least three possibilities. There's the zero possibility that there are no binding norms in anyone. Okay. There is the relativist possibility that you are bound by the norms of your culture, but by none other. And then there is the robust possibility, and that is that there are objective norms and values that are binding on all human beings. Okay. So here's her real argument. This comes on page 318. This is the one that she's been driving towards. Premise one: normality is culturally defined. Right? We got that from the argument up here. So that conclusion becomes a premise, and therefore morality is relative to culture. Okay. Now, here, this is the key term here. Morality is relative to culture. I mean, what's right and wrong is relative to culture. All right. And that makes it sound like she wants that middle position, that there are objective norms and values, but they're objective relative to a culture. Somehow, I don't think she really means that. What she means is, if you want to criticize another culture, just shut up. And that's really what she means. And if I like some of the looser sexual practices of this particular group I'm studying, don't criticize me if I adopt them. I think that's what she means too. But no matter. Let's. I'm not interested in her psychology. I don't care. I need to make sense of her words. All right. And what this means is that if one is the member of a particular culture, one is bound to follow its norms and values. All right. And it's difficult to hear. Very often, one of the norms and values, or one of the norms of a culture, is to criticize foreign cultures, right, for being different, to condemn anything that's different from one's own culture. If that's the norm, then you're required to do it, aren't you? I guess she would point out, yeah, but we're members of Western society. The norm here is not to condemn foreign cultures. And actually, what she's saying is not straightforwardly true, because there are different pockets of Western civilization. You guys follow me? There are different pockets. And there is a large segment of Western civilization that holds very definite values and, frown upon people marrying, 10-year-old girls and consummating the marriage with them and doing other bad things, right? And they're not tolerant of that. And there's another part of the culture which maintains we have to respect foreign cultures. But guess what? In Western civilization, even those persons who kind of are friendly towards relativism, they don't like the idea of consummating. They don't like the idea of pedophilia either, right? Okay, so yeah, best of luck trying to find some moral consistency within our society. It's sort of a big hodgepodge and even a knife fight of sorts, right? As we've experienced the past 10, 15 years. I'm older than you guys, goes back further than that. Okay. All right, so here's an objection. The premise is descriptive and factually true. Normality is culturally defined. That's just a fact. But the conclusion is normative in character. And you can't derive a normative conclusion from a merely factual premise. Okay? Follow me? This tells us something. The premise tells us something about what is the case. The conclusion tells us something about what ought to be, or how one ought to think and act. All right. How do you get from the premise to the conclusion? Make it clearer to you. It is the case that there are persons flying to Thailand to have intercourse with children. That is the case. From that, can you derive the conclusion that that ought to be the case? I mean, that's what happens in that culture, right? So no, you can't, right? And it doesn't just turn on the offensive aspect of that. I mean, so it is the case that in the United States of America, people eat potatoes. Does it follow from that that people ought to eat potatoes? I mean, we're morally bound to do so? It doesn't follow. So there's what is the case and there's what ought to be the case. You guys follow me now? Okay. So from the fact that a group praises paranoia, we'll go back to some of her examples. From the fact that a group praises paranoia, it's a fact, right? Or praises arbitrary acts of revenge, it does not follow that if one is a member of that culture, one ought to cultivate paranoia or a habit of seeking revenge. I mean, that's what they do. It doesn't mean that you ought to behave that way, right? That's a different level of consideration. So it is equally possible that the particular culture has, for whatever reason, adopted false values. It's possible. It also might have adopted true values. I mean, we're looking at this from a very abstract point of view now. And from that abstract point of view, we can consider the bare possibility, right, that paranoia and arbitrary acts of revenge are actually good. But then again, maybe they're bad. You can't derive either conclusion from their factually existing. All sorts of things factually exist, right? In various cultures. It doesn't follow that they're good or bad. They're there. Okay. Well, I'm not saying they're just there. They are there. But whether they're good or bad will turn on other considerations, right? Whether those values are true or false values cannot be settled by appealing to facts about what a culture praises or encourages and what it blames or discourages. You guys follow me? If their values are true, or at least conditionally defensible, right? This rests on more than some group of people asserting that they are true. That's the other features which makes them true. I'll try to explain that. It should be relatively clear in the cases of paranoia and arbitrary revenge. Now, it may be that due to the circumstances, one will, as a matter of course, become paranoid if one takes due precautions against neighbors who just happen to be murderous. I mean, if you're surrounded by murderous neighbors, chances are you're going to become paranoid. It doesn't mean that's good. It just means that's the effect of the environment that you find yourself in. It also may be the case that if one does not react to the death of one's son through an act of killing, one will be regarded as weak, and then that might lead to a war, right? If they think you're weak, they'll attack you. But that doesn't mean that the act of killing one's neighbor arbitrarily, or at least at the inducement of the death of one's son, itself is intrinsically good. It just might be a feature of that particular environment, and there might be a certain cause-effect relationship. It doesn't make the whole situation a good one, if you guys follow what I'm saying, right? It's too bad that they would perceive a person as weak if he didn't take revenge, right? I mean, it's perfectly possible, right, that one could say it's a bad thing that the failure to take revenge for the death of one's son from a flu is perceived as weak, and that entire region would be better off if persons did not have that perception. It'd be a more peaceful society. There'd be less violent death. And people who love one another can spend more time with one another. That seems rather simple. And I think we're entitled to the assumption, now I will argue here, that would be a better eventuality if they gave up those things. Because I'm going to help myself to the assumption that they love one another there, and that family members want one another to remain alive generally. I mean, once in a while there's a little feud, but in general, family members want one another to remain alive. Okay, so they'd be better off if there were less violent death there. So, but neither of these eventualities show that paranoia or murderous vengefulness would be preferable for these groups in the long run over their opposites, right? A kind of calm trust in one's neighbor and a kind of peaceableness. If over the long run, those circumstances permitted that change, that moral reform, right? So as a matter of fact, they're this way now. Why are they obligated to remain that way forever? Simply because they're that way now. That doesn't make any sense. So my conclusion, which I submit to you, is that Benedict's position explodes. That doesn't go anywhere. But Mary Midgley has her own critique here in her delightful little essay, trying out one's new sword. Okay, so she identifies a common thesis, and it is this: we can never understand any culture other than our own well enough to make judgments about it. And she calls that moral isolationism. And it's a certain, it has a certain amount of sense in it, right? I mean, there are certain things going on in Japan. I can't understand what those things are. I'd have to go, I might have to go there and live there for 5 to 10 years and talk to Japanese all that entire time, finally, to get it. Or maybe read a really sharp ethnographic study of the Japanese in order for me to understand certain nuances, right? Okay. But notice, by the way, that I built into my response to that it actually is possible for me to understand those people. It would just take some study, right? Well, okay. What this says is that no amount of study will ever get you inside the skin of somebody from a foreign culture. That's moral isolationism. You might say it that way. You can study for 1 billion years. You'll never get inside one of those foreign cultures. Now, I think that's a little bit, you're not going to live 1 billion years, let's say you did. So it's a very strong thesis, right? It's a very strong thesis. Okay, so people urge moral isolationism out of respect for other cultures, right? We respect them, so we should, not judge them. But here's her objection. Justified respect, not arbitrary respect. I mean, why should we respect these foreign cultures? Well, there's something about them that commands respect, right? That's the idea. And that would be justified respect. So justified respect requires access to those other cultures' features. You can't respect something you can't understand at all. You can't understand it at all. You can't take any attitude towards it, right? What the world is that? What is that thing? I can't understand it at all. So I can either respect it, I can't condemn it, I can't praise it, I can't blame it, I can't approve of it, I can't disapprove of it, I can't condemn it, I can't applaud it, worship it. Seek its annihilation, not justifiably. I don't know what it is, right? Okay. So if moral isolationism is motivated by respect for other cultures, then moral isolationism undermines respect for other cultures, right? So the persons who want us to, they want to encourage us to respect other cultures more and more, right? They shouldn't really urge moral isolationism because it doesn't work. Or if they do, they're going to do so in a manner that produces a logical inconsistency and incidentally will make our culture more stupid. That's what's happened in the past 150 years. That relativism and this moral isolationism has been passed around as if it were self-evident. It's self-evident truth. And by the way, not only are you morally isolated from foreign cultures, and people in this classroom are from multiple cultures, from the Caribbean and South America and Central America and other places, and from the United States. You spent like equal time between the two places. So you guys actually embody two cultures. Okay, so what to do with you? what to do. So I guess you're a hybrid of two cultures, and I can't judge you because I have no idea what it's like to be, let's say, from Nicaragua and Rhode Island. Well, you're right. I don't. I wasn't raised in Nicaragua. I was raised in New York, which is a little bit closer to Rhode Island. But Rhode Island's quite different from New York, let me tell you. Let me tell you. So I better not judge anyone. Okay. Here we go. If we can, with justification, admire features of a foreign culture, then we can, with equal justification, criticize certain features of that foreign culture. That's her conclusion, right? You get that? So if we can admire them, we can criticize them too. You get both those at once or neither. Right. So being able to judge our own culture is greatly forwarded. Her next conclusion. Being able to judge our own culture is greatly forwarded, right, by comparative judgments. We want to evaluate foreign cultures, so it's better to understand our own. Otherwise put, it's to our benefit to evaluate foreign cultures and potentially harmful not to do so. And if you're from Nicaragua and Rhode Island, it's to your benefit to analyze the Japanese and think about them. Okay? The Russians and whoever else. So now what are the possibility of just saying, I'm not going to pass any moral judgments on anyone whomsoever. I'll become an immoralist, not in the sense of promoting immorality, but in the sense of just denying that there are moral distinctions and not taking any moral positions. Well, that's impossible. We saw that in Hegel, if you recall. In Hegel, the ironist is a kind of immoralist. He refuses to commit himself one way or another. Well, that doesn't work because you have to act. As soon as you act, that itself expresses a preference. You can say, well, I did that, but I could have done something else. And that's the best you can do as an ironist. I mean, we've already talked about this. So you do something. You say, well, I could have done the opposite, but you did that. So you expressed a preference. You expressed the preference and then you immediately negated it, but you expressed it. Okay? So immoralism is impossible for a practical agent. At best, you can express a preference and then change your mind or say that you didn't really mean it, or you could do so tepidly, but you have to make choices. Even if you choose to lay down in bed and not move ever again, that's a choice too. You're stuck. Okay? You're assuming it's better to do so, or it's better to do nothing than to engage with humanity and pursue some purpose in life. And even if the purpose is just eating a lot of ice cream or something, I don't want to do that anymore and to lay down in bed. Well, guess what? You made a preference. You are judging that laying down in bed and staying there is good. That's it. Immoralism does not exist for human beings. As I said at the beginning of the course, we're by nature oriented towards the good. We're by nature oriented towards the true. And we by nature seek beauty. And boy, there's a lot of effort to kind of rattle the cage and get out of those basic facts. And there's nothing that can be done. It's better just to accept it and then figure out how you're going to lead the rest of your life on the basis of certain indestructible facts. That's what it is. Your life will go a lot better once you just accept the indestructible facts, start reorganizing your approach to life on the basis of those facts, and trying to achieve the aims you're pointed towards by nature. You can't get out of it. All right, so relativism is less a doctrine to be taken seriously, she says, than a weapon in the hands of those who have adopted an absolutist moral position. Aha! Well, absolutism is the opposite of relativism. And that position is that absolutely and without exception, one is to tolerate even the most extreme practices of foreign cultures. All right. And there's no exception to that. Suddenly relativism disappears, right? When we say that there's no exception to anything. And I suggest child brides and human sacrifice, so on and so forth. You say, oh, there are no contemporary cultures that engage in human sacrifice. Really? What about our own? Okay, I'm not going to provide you with the example. You think about that. Okay, I think there are multiple forms of human sacrifice we engage in here. All right. So in fact, multicultural relativist secretly expects that those who adopt his position will come to develop a taste like his own. Right? It's sort of a trick it's sort of a bait and switch. Try the relativism a little bit, and then you'll become not a relativist. You'll become an applauder and a fan of basically non-Western civilization. That's what that comes down to. You'll start listening to, ragas, Indian ragas and Chinese opera and stuff of that sort. You'll develop a taste for that stuff. You'll gradually come to despise our traditions, particularly Christianity. That's what they have in mind most of the time. But also capitalism, right? Which is not a Christian product at all. and maybe even modern Western technology. You'll despise all these things in favor of whatever alternatives there are out there. And by the way, Indian music is quite fascinating, and Chinese, I can't really cultivate a taste for Chinese opera, but some people have. And yes, I mean, samurai swords look quite wonderful. I wouldn't mind studying, the art of making a samurai sword. I think it'd be a worthwhile thing. I'm a pretty open-minded guy, right? So I mean, what Midgley is not arguing for is being a narrow-minded prig or a chauvinist. She's saying the opposite. Spend your time obviously studying your own traditions and your own culture, and study foreign cultures too, and make comparative judgments. Be a generous-hearted, broad-minded person who could draw moral distinctions and gradually grow in your knowledge of the true, the good, and the beautiful through your engagement with world civilization. That's what she's arguing for. You follow me? Not be a chauvinistic prig who bats down any foreigner who pops up. No, the exact opposite of that. And the example that she offered was the Shushigiri, trying out one's new samurai sword on the first chance passerby. We've already commented on this, but do it again. And this was a practice that was part of pre-modern Japanese society. We make a couple of observations. It's dubious that you know what dubious means? It means you can doubt it. It's dubious that every member of society approved of this practice. People getting chopped in half, I think we can fairly say, did not approve of this. It is also dubious that every member ought to have approved it. And that's really the key. This is a moral philosophy course. So we must imaginatively extend ourselves into that society and hazard judgments based on reflection, study, and common sense. And I've hazarded a judgment. I feel like I'm on solid. You guys tell me. You can object if you like. I feel like I'm on solid ground if there are people who just object to being chopped in half. If you disagree, send me an email. So Philip Hallie is concerned with cruelty, right? From cruelty to goodness. He finds now cruelty. He found that etymologically has to do with the shedding of blood. He's right about that. Yeah. Now you just look it up in an etymological dictionary. American Heritage is pretty good. You find out that's right. So he said historically it's based on power differentials. So one person has a great deal of power relative to another group of people. That person ends up being cruel towards the second group of people. I think we witness that in our own society. That there are persons who are worth billions and billions of dollars, or are very, very famous to the point, all they have to do is walk, appear in the vicinity of a restaurant, they're instantly ushered in and given a free meal, very high quality, so on and so forth. These persons, they have an experience completely unlike our own, and so they look upon us as a group of peasants who are not merely less fortunate than they are, but are really contemptible and even meriting punishment. Now, that might sound a little dark to you guys, but I think I'd have to do maybe a couple of weeks on that or something. That would be more of a sociological study than a philosophical study. I can provide plenty of evidence for that. I mean, there's a, that the Hollywood actors and, powerful persons in the business world and in banking, they get together and they have parties where they have a big cake that's in the shape of a human being, and they pretend to cannibalize someone, right? It's like a cannibalism party with a cake sort of thing. Those sorts of things are highly symbolic. That I say is an indication of the underlying attitude these people have towards the peasants, you and me. I'm not saying resent them. I think they're actually in a sad place because a human being can't look at lotto winners. A human being can't withstand being in a position where suddenly all of his desires or her desires are reflexively satisfied. That's a bad position to be in because many of our desires are disordered. So you want to be in a position where you can't satisfy all of them. It's better. You'll be better off. Okay. So if you end up, whatever you end up managing an Arby's or something. Maybe you want something better than that. You end up settling into $75,000 a year, and you have your partner making whatever. You can get by pretty comfortably too with your partner's salary. That's pretty good. You're saying, oh no, I want to be wealthy. I'm not going to stop you. It's your life. Okay, so when you see these power differentials, I perceive a gradation entering. First, if one person doesn't have to care for the other, the first thing that enters is indifference to the well-being of the other person. not against that person, right? But they're not for them either, and they don't care what happens to that person, right? Common enough. Second level is willingness to harm the other person for self-gain. We find that in various sorts of business venture and whatnot. The government, the way it treats its soldiers and the like. Then there's the willingness to harm as an expression of hatred or contempt, right? I think the cannibalism party is an expression of that. Okay. And at the extreme, we have like Nazi Germany and the Gulag under Stalin, and Pol Pot's experiment with killing 2 million Cambodians, and Mao's experiment of killing, depends on who you contact about this, which scholar you talk to, 20 to 60 million Chinese. There we have torture and extermination. Okay? And most of that killing was not done by Hitler, it was done by communists. I mean, Hitler was awful. He's one of the top mass murderers historically, but somehow his name has become synonymous with absolute evil when we have a number of people this century who were going neck and neck with Hitler or even surpassed him. I think Stalin ultimately killed more people than Hitler. Mao is right up there, Chairman Mao, the little red book. Right, then they come out with a new TikTok replacement called Little Red Book. Okay, you want to outlaw TikTok? How about this, the Little Red Book? Pol Pot, top murderer, torturer, so on and so forth. And there's about some lesser lights in the area of mass murder and torture. Okay, what is the aim of cruelty? The aim of cruelty is the crushing of the self-respect of the victim. Get that? The crushing of the self-respect of the victim. So he says, there's something to that, right? It's not merely to just cause pain. I guess people do that when they torture animals or something. Animals don't have any self-respect. All of you grew up with some weird person who enjoyed torturing squirrels or something like that. And who knows what the cause of that was, something at home, I don't know. All right, but when people are torturing human beings, that goes beyond that. That goes beyond destroying the self-respect of the person. Well, again, this is a very dark chapter here, but this is a part of human experience, and we have to spend a little time talking about this. And then during the conflicts of the 90s in the Balkans, groups of soldiers would deliberately rape the women of the opposed group. Okay. And that seems to have been to destroy their self-respect, to destroy their sense of security in their own body, to replace their sense of security and self-respect with a kind of self-loathing and a hatred of their own body, which have been defiled. I mean, it's all really dark and horrible, and with this we all pray this would never have happened to anyone, and it does, and then we pray for healing for the people who suffer something so horrible. All right, so sorry about all the dark stuff today. Let's talk about Le Chambon-Saint-Lignon. Pardon my bad French. So this was a town in southern France that received, I believe, a pretty good number of Jewish children, whatever the number was. I forgot from the text there, 6,000 or something. Saved their lives, risking their own necks, knowing that if they were caught harboring Jewish children, not only would those Jewish children be herded away and sent to concentration camps, but they themselves would have been packed away to concentration, if not shot on the spot, right? Now, I believe that was late in the war. Just as a matter of historical detail, by that point, the extermination segment of the Holocaust had been turned off, and they had, I mean, they already killed almost 6 million people by that point, but then they had turned to forced labor. And then right towards the end, they took the forced laborers and had them jog incredible amounts of miles, or kilometers, they would think, from one place to another as the Allies closed in. And who knows how many people they killed that way. When you add it all together, it was about 5,700,000. And I mentioned before, there's a kind of growing, kind of strange community of pro-Hitler sentiment occurring online. You guys really have to look at the historical facts, okay? It helps to know those stories. I think I mentioned these before, but I'll just tell you. Heinrich Himmler, he ordered that all of the gas chambers be exploded. This order came on November 25th of 1944. That's why when you go to the concentration camps, you can't find the gas chambers because they destroyed them. Okay, so skeptics say, oh, there were no gas chambers. Well, they were there, right? And we have pictures of them actually, and eyewitnesses, and there's documentation in the German archives. You know, it's all been made public. You have to read an actual historian of this material, you know, to get these kind of fine-grained details. They said, "Oh, look, there were Jews who were being taken care of. They had a nice, you know, nice apartment building, so on and so forth." So to speak, like once they transitioned from extermination to forced labor, they improved the conditions just slightly, right? So that the persons will be healthy enough to help them make their shells and, you know, other implements they needed to fight the war. Even then, they weren't treated well, actually horribly. You got to do a little reading. Okay, so that's where that stuff came from. You know, there were some apparently tolerable living conditions. Oh, a third thing, there was supposedly a part of Auschwitz where the Jews were fed well and allowed to put on theatrical productions. That's actually true, but that was done for PR purposes, right? So they could always use that as an example, but they could always lie and say all the camps were like that. So they had this one little corner where things were halfway decent, and they went on with the slaughter until late, what was it, September, October, my memory might be faulty there, 1943 or something like that. Auschwitz is sort of the symbol of the whole thing. They killed about 500,000 people at Auschwitz. Okay, all right. So you can check my facts. You can turn to Dan Brown, not Dan Brown. That's the fiction author. Dan Stone. That's his name. It's called The Holocaust: An Unfinished History. And there are a couple of chapters in there which is just treated the Holocaust proper, and you can get the facts that way. Been a bloody century, and I recommend, you know, it's again a dark lecture today. You can look at that, and then I very strongly recommend you look at Solzhenitsyn, Alexander Solzhenitsyn's book. Don't worry about spelling that. It's called the Gulag, Gulag Archipelago. Okay. So you type into Gulag Archipelago, Archipelago, okay? That's about what Stalin set up, okay? And the millions of people who were swallowed whole out there in Siberia. So that you should read. And if that's just too grim for you, I'm not going to judge you, right? We're talking about judging people today. I'm not going to judge you if you choose not to read those books, or even, well, you know, you do save yourself some time. Just get on YouTube, type in Gulag Archipelago, and you'll get a 1 or 2 hour presentation on it. It'll be peppered with striking and horrifying facts, and you'll walk away knowing something you didn't know before, and that'll be the end of it. I learned all sorts of things. I mean, kind of going on. We're talking about evil right now, so let's, well, why don't we do it? Turns out Karl Marx, who was the person who inspired the Soviets, the Bolsheviks to establish the Soviet Union. There were all sorts of strange things about him and evil, as it were. His favorite quote, I'm going a little digression here, but I see I have time to do this, I'm doing it. He said his favorite quote was from Goethe's Faust, Goethe's Goethe, okay, Wolfgang Goethe, arguably the greatest poet, generally regarded as the greatest poet of the German language tradition. And he wrote a play called Faust, F-A-U-S-T. And Faust, he was a guy like me, wanted to know everything. And he got frustrated because he actually learned everything there was to know about nature, but he wanted to keep going, so he turned to the occult. Okay? It's like a John Dee type figure. Interesting guy, actually. And he ended up summoning the devil. And there's a quote that Goethe puts in the mouth of Mephistopheles, another name for the devil. Here's the quote: "Everything that exists deserves to perish." You know, that was Karl Marx's favorite quote in all of literature. Okay, very good. How about this? He also wrote a play called Ulanem, O-U-L-A-N-E-M, shot through with diabolical imagery in the whole thing. So the person suggests it's rather hard to read because of it, but you know, I'll just let you know that it exists. It's an anagram of Emmanuel, by the way. God is with us. When Karl Marx's son wrote to Karl Marx, he said, "My dear devil." Okay, you know, I mean, it's just one. You could say that's just a kind of playful mode of address. If it happened just once, it would be. His wife, Karl Marx's wife, addressed him, as my wicked knave. Interesting. All right. And then Engels, his close associate, said, this dark man from Trier, the monster of 10,000 devils. Okay. I mean, these are all the people closest to him. His son, his wife, is basically his best friend, right? He wrote this, basically this diabolical play, and he said that everything that exists deserves to perish is his favorite quote. And he actually did embark upon the destruction of Western civilization. That's what, Marxism maintains the family is evil, and political society is evil, and Christianity is evil, and all these things need to be negated. And then we'll all just kind of live on our own on a plain somewhere, on a mountain, just doing our own thing. Okay, well, best of luck. Let's see here. Karl Marx's father said, since that heart is obviously governed by a demon not granted to all men, is that demon heavenly or Faustian? Right? Okay, very good. And then another fellow named, let's see here, named Robert Payne, who was, let's see, a chapter called The Demons. There were times when Marx seemed to be possessed by demons. Okay, I'm not making any supernatural or preternatural claims here. I'm just saying everyone who surrounded this guy seems to have had a kind of consistent opinion about him. He was aiming at the destruction of human society, and he did say that everything, his favorite quote is that everything should be destroyed. Well, let's see here. Marx had the devil's view of the world and the devil's malignity. Sometimes he seemed to know he was accomplishing works of evil. I think that's Robert Payne as well, but unfortunately I didn't record who produced that. I'll find that out. If someone could be kind enough to send me an email, remind me to get that piece of information. I know where to get it. And a lot of this information is available in Richard Wurmbrand, W-U-R-M-B-R-A-N-D. It's called Marx and Satan. Okay, those arresting titles. It's hard to forget those titles when you see them. Let's see here. Karl Marx also said, my friends, I wish to avenge myself against the one who rules above. Okay, that's intelligible on the face of it, right? Let's see. He also would refer to Robin Goodfellow. That was a nickname he would use in his writings repeatedly. Robin Goodfellow is a nickname for Lucifer, folks, okay? All right. And then he had a maid. His maid, Marx, he presented himself in public as an atheist. Actually, according to his maid, you have to always question these sources. His maid reported that he would pray in his room with a kind of a tape measure tied around his head. Now, he was ethnically Jewish, but not a practicing Jew. And given everything that's been said about him, there's a reasonable suspicion he was a practicing devil worshiper. That's not to say the devil exists or doesn't exist. It's to say that there's reasonable suspicion he believes the devil existed or exists and that he worshipped him. I'm not saying anything either way. You can read that book by the Wurmbrand guy. And there's another fellow. What's his name? I can get the other name for you. I can't remember it at the moment. All right, so there you go. This is what I want to suggest to you people. There are evil people. Want to destroy human society, destroy the family, destroy all religious communities, destroy all political association, because they want to avenge themselves against the one who rules from on high. That's what it says right there. Okay. So I know many people are reluctant to believe that, but the facts are facts, and so you can do with the facts what you please. I'm not going to dictate to you how to live. I'm going to dictate to you how to write your final paper. Right? I want a solid thesis statement, reasonable argumentation, clear writing, and things of that sort. You guys follow me? Once you're free of me, you're free of me. That's the end of that. All right. So the people of Chambon-sur-Lignon, they went beyond trying to establish an equality of power, right? Because the original thesis was that if we eliminate power differentials, we'll get rid of cruelty. That's probably true. Yeah. The people of Chambon-sur-Lignon, they went further. They opposed cruelty with hospitality by inviting all these Jewish children into their homes, knowing that this could result in their being extinguished. So I went on some long digression, but I think it was a valuable digression. So here we have to acknowledge the role of religious belief. Well, we haven't talked about much in this course. A little bit, but even with Aquinas and we talked about natural law in the main, and with Augustine, we argue for the existence of God, but we do so on the basis of natural reason, right? So there hasn't been any strict religious content in this course as yet. I know most of you think there has been. I keep seeing that in the journals and in the papers. Augustine bases his position on faith. In a way, that's true, but he also gives you rationalistic proofs for the existence of God. So you don't have to be Christian to believe in God, right? He shows you how you believe in God without necessarily being a Christian. Then he would say, oh, by the way, since you believe in God, you believe in someone powerful enough to make his will to you known, and start reading this book called the Bible, you'll find out what he actually wants you to do with your life. If you read it with an open mind, you'll be convinced. Maybe he would say something like that, kind of abbreviating it. Okay, so the religious belief that's most important for the people of La Chambon-sur-Lignon is the absolute value of the human being as proven in Christ's incarnation. Now that, folks, is the first theological thesis we've encountered in this course. Okay? You can say maybe Augustine, but I think even there you can push that book back towards a purely philosophical position. But now we're talking about the incarnation of God. That is a theological position. And the people of Chambon-sur-Lignon, they definitely accepted that, and that was the basis for their belief in the absolute value of the human being. Okay, so let's talk about absolute values now. Well, if you have an absolute value, it's absolute, right? It's immovable. And there's nothing which is superior to the absolute value. It's absolute, indestructible, and supreme. So in that case, one is willing to die rather than to violate or stand indifferent before the absolute value. You're not even allowed to, in your own conscience, to stand indifferent before it. You have to defend the absolute value. Some of you are saying, well, this seems to be a kind of idolatry of the human being, because God is the absolute value and the human being is second. Well, these people were Christian, and they saw that Christ very clearly said, when you treat these children, I don't remember the exact passage, but when you feed these children, you're feeding me. Or when you're helping the poor, you're helping me. Mainly, basically, that you're going to serve me, the absolute value of God, by serving human beings. So they by derivation, right, by kind of divine dispensation, receive absolute value because they now represent God. Yes, follow? And that's a characteristic of the Western civilization. Now, I've said it before, I'll say it again. I think the distinctive characteristic of Western civilization since Christian Rome in the 4th century is the concern for the marginalized, the weak, and the oppressed. Okay, and that you find that even amongst the most strident atheists in our society, who are concerned, in their mind, they're concerned for the marginalized, the weak, and the oppressed generally. You guys follow me? They have their own particular groups of victims whom they regard as the persons you really are obligated to help out. Okay, you can fill in the blanks. So number 4, an absolute value. Next point requires this heroism, right? Because you have to now exert yourself very strenuously, risking your life and perhaps being killed for the sake of the absolute value. You might have to subsist on 1 meal a day. You might have to go on a 3-month difficult hike through cold and heat. You guys follow me? For the sake of defending the absolute value of the human being. So therefore, it requires a will to accept martyrdom for its own sake. So here we're getting all these concepts here. There was a whole town of people. So don't tell me that, it's out of reach. The average person can't be like this. Well, we know that's bunk because a whole town of people was like this. Say, well, they were special. No, they weren't. That's impossible. They were just like everybody else. They happened to have a good preacher who fired him up. That's what that comes down to. Okay. Finally, the absolute value requires, here the absolute value is, what is the absolute value? Well, the absolute value of the human being implies, I should say, sacrificial love of the neighbor, one who is near one, the proximo, we say down in Peru, and in need, the weak, the person who's desperate. That's the distinctive characteristic of the West. It's not distinctive of India with the Hindu religion. Because if you see a poor person in India, you say he deserves it. He must have done something evil in his past life. Let him suffer. Okay. I don't want to care. If you're Indian or something like that, I don't want to caricature your society. If I'm being too harsh or inaccurate, I really do welcome correction because I haven't lived there. I've taught Hinduism, but we got our Western scholars who talk about this stuff, and their perspective might be slightly skewed. I do appreciate a kind of moderate Benedictine point of view, but it has to be moderate. It has to be like, okay, proceed cautiously with these foreign cultures. Anyway, but the Hinduism does teach that there's a caste system. It does teach reincarnation, right? It does teach that if you are born into a position of suffering, that is because of things you've done in your past life. I mean, these are just doctrines of Hinduism. I read them in translations of the original Hindu texts, so that's that. Okay. So what I want to suggest is that this is arguably what's missing in Hegel, this religious point of view. Now, a lot of you were impressed with Hegel, I have to say. Some of that has to do with the fact that I'm, something resembling a Hegel scholar. Right? I mean, I published on Hegel and I put, thousands of hours into studying Hegel, so I can explain him better than almost anything else except Plato. Okay, and if I got, I have a dissertation on Aristotle too. If I got back into that, I could bring that up to the same level quickly. So a lot of you were impressed with him, but I suggest there's something missing in him, even though there's a lot that is impressive in him. So let's say this. The thing that impressed you guys most was this, mutual recognition, right? And I agree. We need to respect one another is what that boils down to. And more than that, you depend for your own self-awareness on your existing within networks of mutual recognition or really mutual respect for the humanity of the persons we live with, okay? But his scheme will ultimately depend on more than mutual recognition. Mutual recognition does not go far enough. That's the thesis I'm exploring right now. So the society he extols requires a class of public servants single-mindedly dedicated to the public good, right? He has to have a class of dedicated civil servants in order for that whole thing to work. But this requires not merely respect for one's fellow person. It has to go beyond that, but the spirit of sacrifice, the sacrificial love of neighbor. That's the only way you're really going to get that. You guys follow? It requires the perception that a human being is a living, thinking, acting, absolute value. And then, like the people of Chambon-Saint-Lyon, you're motivated to help them. Get that? That perception of absolute value cannot be bootstrapped up through mutual recognition. That doesn't happen. That has to come from above. Okay, so that's provided by religion alone. Hence, the journey for Hegel, we'll do it for time, must be continued. So we began with desire. We saw that an individual trying to dominate another individual can't even enjoy the recognition he seeks because he dismisses the other person with the recognition that person would otherwise give him. So he ends up being kind of trapped within himself. He doesn't develop. And in order to get the recognition he wants, he has to recognize the other guy, right? So then we end up at this level, mutual recognition of property, minimally your own body, the level of abstract right. Now that involves abstracting for all purposes. It doesn't make any sense because maintaining a society based on abstract right is a purpose, right? So that enacts the transition to moral subjectivity. And there you want to base your life on private conscience, but that degenerates into a multiplicity of worldviews that clash with one another and the arbitrariness of the moral subject who ultimately becomes an ironist and finally declares that the good is simply what I think it is, which is absolute evil. Okay? Which is absolute evil. That, if you think of the absolute evil as a serial killer, that's what turns a person into a serial killer. All right. So we need to take what's good in all these things here, the institution of property and moral subjectivity and conscience. We have to ground them in ethical institutions. And within ethical institutions, you want to make this easy. Go back to St. Thomas Aquinas. We get our basic goods back, and maybe without God at this point, but we have to make the transition to God in a second. So we get the good of the family, the good of the political community, the good of the virtues, Obviously, the good of biological life, right? So we have 5 of them right there. All we need is a relationship to God. We have all 6. And so that's what we need to do, make the transition now to a religiously instilled conviction of the absolute value of each human being through, I said, the divine dispensation of absoluteness from God to the human being. That's the only way you get that. You can't bottom up that value. It has to come from the top. Okay? So then you end up with the whole thing. So you can, we can't do everything in this course, but you can begin to think about how to take ideas from Aquinas and start stitching those together with Hegel, and you end up with a positive moral system. As some of you like Mill, even though Mill tells us that we're all worthless, you can say that once you've, acted on the virtues and respected the rights of others, and in this scheme, the widened scheme I'm describing here, honor God, then with what's left over, you should maximize happiness. You should maximize, happiness isn't the right word, but you should maximize the degree to which people can lead a pleasant life. Okay? You guys follow? Another way of putting it is minimizing suffering. So both those things, right? Because they're just 2 sides of the same coin. All right, I hope that makes some sense to you guys. That's where we are so far. All this stuff you can continue to study. Like I only gave you like a little snip of Aquinas. He goes on and on and on about the virtues. I mean, it's like hundreds and hundreds of pages. So at some point, I should give you some links. You can just all the stuff most worth reading. It's all free online. Isn't that remarkable? You don't have to spend a dime literally for the rest of your life. Now you might have to look at the stuff on the screen, which is not very important. So you might want to print it out, or you can just go to a decent book sale and find a lot of this stuff is being given away for like 25 cents a book, or fill a bag for $5 or something of that sort. You'll be perfectly well, or just borrow the books from the library for free. There's the solution, right? All right, folks. So that's my lecture for today. And have any questions or observations, please contact me. All right, I enjoyed doing that. And I wish you guys the best. Be well. Oh yeah, obviously I'll post assignments and all that. Be well.